And by late February, it was melting and pretty much in place. We had zero runoff. Virtually all of that snow melted in place and soaked in, which was good, but which also meant we had nothing going into the streams, rivers, and lakes as a result. And then it continued dry. So there's the time period from September 1st of 2019 into late May of 2020 on the left. So that was a fall flood in 2019, a spring flood in 2020, and that was the excess precipitation during that, how many months do I have up there? 8? And those of you that have listened to me talk over the years know that that is the critical moisture content for our spring floods. Why? Because in the summer, the rain that happens in the summer, a lot of that is used for plant growth and crop production, so we don't see much carrying over unless we've already hit it. Fall is critical to soil moisture recharge in this basin. The wintertime snowpack, depending on how much snow you get, heck, most of it's going to run off into the lakes and rivers. Only a fraction of that is going to soak into the ground when spring thaw comes, and then you may or may not have spring moisture, spring rain. So fall is critical to that process. And there you have September 1st, 2020 to May 31st of 2021. And now you've got 7-8 inches below normal. There ain't no flood going on. And I crossed out the word potential spring summer flash drought because when I was briefing this past year, it was still potential. Well, then it materialized in a big way. There's the actual map, September 1st through the end of July. And you can see 9, 10, 11, 12 inch below normal for precipitation during that period. And that's the Crookston Ag Research Site. And that's the 11.9 inches below normal. That's a total of 5.67 inches during that time period. That is the lowest on record. And that's a record that goes back to 1880, 70 something. That's one of the longest ones out there. Okay, what's the second place? Well, that's 1980. Is Dana still around here, our canoe person? Okay, canoeing down the river. Anyway, so that's so at a lot of the areas, 79 into 80 kind of is analogous to some of the things we're seeing here. Does anybody remember the 1979 flood? What happened after the 1979 flood? Well, we kind of went into a drought, later part of 79 and into early 80. Okay, and then we came out of it. So we'll see how prescient Ted is. So the important questions here, and some of these were what people were asking during the drought. So this ends up being the biggest wildfire year ever in the history of North Dakota and Minnesota, at least is how they track it. So we had at the end of March, one day, we had a wildfire down in Richland County, west of Wahpeton, one over in Spirit Lake Reservation, southwest of Devil's Lake, and another one that kicked in West Polk County over here, just to the west of Mentor and Maple Lake area, that were over 5,000 acres in that one day. In one day, they grew to over 5,000 acres. I think Spirit Lake got somewhere around 8 to 9,000 acres, and the Mentor fire that got up to 13,000 acres. So we're talking 8, 9, 10, 11, how many square miles of burning in a day or two. So again, those resources, both from a state as well as the local firefighters and all the response, was wiped out to begin with, and that continued. The state of North Dakota issued a drought and wildfire emergency in early April, a disaster declaration. Minnesota followed with a drought emergency declaration later in the summer. Widespread hay and forage losses, widespread crop production losses, leading from lack of germination, lack of growth, and then also what does that impact on yield? And I don't know the answer to all those questions. I've only seen some of it. Drought, wildfire, disaster, as I said, declared. So in the process of, well, I'm going to back up again. And then what would it take? These are the tough questions. What would it take to recover from this drought? Those were questions the media was asking, plus everybody else was asking, because farmers were already saying, okay, if we write off this year, what's going to recover and what do we have to look forward to next year? So that's the end of May. and that's the drought map on the background. That's a North Dakota Department of Ag product off their hay hotline. But you can see, if you can tell, those black spots over in northwest Minnesota and one there in east central, one in southeast or south central North Dakota. Those are the people that are selling hay. So at that point in late May, Minnesota still had some moisture. They had gotten some rain. They had a little more snow on that side. People were actually making that first cutting of hay. It wasn't that great, and they were selling some of their surplus. North Dakota had nothing. There was nobody cutting hay in that central, north central, and western part. And then eventually Minnesota started going downhill quickly. And so there's just a little over 4.5 months ago, that's the Drought Monitor analysis, and that's showing D4, that dark brown. That's the first time in Minnesota had seen D4 in the history of this product, but this product only goes back to the year 2000. What's been happening in this part of the country during that entire time, just about? We've actually been above normal precipitation since the fall of 92, 93 period, the wet cycle that we've talked about for decades now. So from the fall of 92, spring of 93, through somewhere in the 20 teens, we were in this rather wet cycle. So it's easy to see why we wouldn't have had D4 in this turf during that time period, because we were getting above normal precipitation. Well, now just a little bit over 2 months ago, there you can see the improvement. So what was occurring between August and November? Rain. So the end of August into September, we started getting rain. And so when I was doing storm damage surveys for tornadoes and other stuff, I was off Steele County, so that's east central North Dakota, and up into West Polk County for different stuff, and talking to farmers, and they'd point to, there's this field that we just started harvesting of wheat, and we're getting 25, 30 bushels an acre maybe, but right across the road where they got that 1 inch of rain in June, we're getting 50, 60 bushel an acre. So just the importance of that one thunderstorm that came through and happened to hit this field or not. In the Minnesota side, the farmer's talking about, yeah, but the sugar beets, they're long, skinny tap roots. And so we got talking about it. Well, do you think if they got rain, they'd be able to recover? And he says, I don't know. You know, if we get rain early enough, they may still be able to swell and produce. Does anybody know what happened to the sugar beet crop, by the way? They got rain. They managed to swell and produce, and they got one of their best sugar yields. And overall, this was their, third best year for American Crystal Sugar because of that. They're the only crop that had that type of production. Oh, the other thing is, once those rains started in late August into September, I was driving across parts of central and eastern North Dakota, northwest Minnesota at that time again, and people were cutting and baling hay. On the North Dakota side, it was the first time ever. It's not often in September in central and eastern North Dakota you see fresh round bales of hay, because usually they would not be cutting that late. So many of you have seen this type of graph. That's the many years of, the green line is our precipitation during that fall, winter, spring scenario. And it's highly variable. And that's just that core, and it corresponds really well with those bars below there, which are our water year annual flows. So the flood years line up nicely with those excessive rainfall years, or the combination of multiple wet years. And then the drop off at the end, which I haven't filled in there yet. But the analog to that, of course, between flooding is on the bottom side of those green lines. And notice that steady progression upward of those. Well, it's the dry years. So this is an analysis of SPI. This is Standardized Precipitation Index. And this is looking kind of in a 24-month rolling average, if you will, one way to describe it. But you can see from 1990 on, it's actually 92, 93 on, you can see that the majority of those are above normal precipitation years. Well, if you look at that blip at the end, that's 2021. And 2021 from a long-term flood standpoint was not that impressive, because it's a flash drought. It's quick onset and it looks to be going off. So it's not a big impact from that perspective. Certainly not as important as, well, even the 2011-12 shows up in there. the 88, 89, 90 period. So those multi-year, more impactful, certainly the dirty 30s, the 50s, back in the 70s, some of those droughts. But if we look at shorter intervals on there, and this would be the 3, 6, 9 month periods, that's for Northwest Minnesota alone, and that's 2021. So that's one of the most profound droughts. So you are for flash droughts. So we already showed that in the Crookston data for one single point, but this is for the whole northwest part of Minnesota, averaged in there. And you can see that, well, there's 79, 80 that's showing up, and there's back in the 30s showing up with that flash episode. And then here's for Northeast North Dakota. And just to show up again that it was the worst in that quarter of the state of North Dakota, and that is the worst rapid onset flash flood going in there. And then those are the counties, that's for 11 months. The 11-month period, you can see all those counties in North Dakota, Minnesota that are dark brown, that's their driest on record going back to 1885. And those brown ones to the south of us, toward Fargo, those are their second or third driest. And we're getting better. So we'll talk about that process. Notice that improvement in the South Basin. 6 months ago, there was the 1st and 5th percentile driest all across here. Now that graph on the right shows wetter than normal in the South Basin. Wetter than normal. That's the anomaly, how much off the soil moisture is. And it's showing, you know, that South Basin has got a little bit above normal moisture in it right now, a whole bunch of near normal, and then maybe ½ inch to an inch below up in the wings. So how have we recovered from the drought? There's a satellite analysis, NASA sport image, and that shows part of southern Manitoba in there. So it shows some improvement in the soil moisture up there. So I think this is where I throw it over to Carly. Are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, and I got your first slide up. So Carly Delavau, is Brian with you?
Brian should be on. Maybe I'll just ask him to put his camera on quickly and say hello. There he is.
Put your
Yeah,
hands
I'm going to turn our cameras off and we'll get going here. Thanks for handling the slides, Greg. Okay, so what Brian and I are going to cover today, we'll start with taking kind of a recap of how the drought of 2021 started up and how it progressed over the summer. Then we'll get into some of the impacts and the provincial response that we as the government of Manitoba did for the drought. And we'll end with kind of trying to look at the question, where are we now, taking a quick snapshot of current conditions. Next slide, Greg, please. Okay, so starting with the progression of the drought last year. So this is showing winter precipitation percentiles from November 1st of 2020 through till the end of March of 2021 for the winter season. So this is based on about 30 years of data or so. So you can see that most of southern Manitoba there is classified as exceptionally low, which is somewhere between either the lowest on record or the second percentile for this period of time. So one of our lowest snowfall years, at least in the last 30 years or so of record. Next slide. So now I'll walk you through a series of the Canada-US Drought Monitor maps, similar to what Greg was showing earlier. Just a reminder to folks, so D0 is the abnormally dry conditions. Those are in the yellow, and it ranges up to D3 or D4. So D3 is the red, showing a 20 to 50 year event, and D4 is exceptional drought, which is the dark red brown color, which is a 50+ year event. So starting here in March of last year, Greg already mentioned the real lack of runoff that we saw. So that's kind of when we started to see these extreme drought conditions kind of come to fruition. So yeah, Greg, you can just walk through the next few slides here. So you can see extreme drought is expanding in April. And if we move on to May, I think this is where we start to see some pockets of exceptional drought, as well into June. Those are expanding. And by the end of July into early August, this is where we peaked in at least southern Manitoba for the drought of 2021. You can see we have quite a large region of D4. We did get some timely rains in August, and that did relieve conditions a little bit, but we still had large regions of D3 and D4 in southern Manitoba. So moving into the fall a bit more, into September, again, some more timely rains, which did shrink our exceptional drought contours there, but we still have not gotten out of the woods yet. And the last one I have here is October, which again, some minor improvements, definitely less D3, but we're still, having severe drought to exceptional drought across much of Agro-Manitoba. Okay, so that just quickly recaps the drought conditions that we saw over 2021. So now I'll get more into the impacts and how we responded as a province. So I'll begin by passing it over to Brian for this slide and for a portion of the next slide. Brian, do you want to take it from here?
Sure, Carly, thank you. And I just see some comments, some people are having trouble viewing slides, and what I'm going to be saying, you can just follow along with what I'm talking about without seeing the slide, and hopefully that'll get resolved. So thank you very much for the lead in terms of the weather. And I just want to recap our situation in Manitoba, what happened with the drought and the impacts on the agriculture sector. And when we think about agriculture, really I'm going to be talking about three different areas. One of them is the livestock sector. One is sort of the non-irrigated crops, which is a bulk of Manitoba, so basically the dryland crop production. And then I am going to touch on what happened with the irrigation sector. And Manitoba is predominantly a dryland producing province. Like, we rely on rain for our agriculture production, with the exception of irrigated acres. We only irrigate about 1% in Manitoba, but that accounts for about 10% of our farm gate value. So I'm going to talk about that. So when we think about the livestock sector and what happened with no snowfall, that started off right off in the spring, impacting the livestock sector because it wasn't enough runoff to fill the water supplies on pastures that livestock producer needs. So right off the bat, early mid-April, when there was no rain, people were already golfing in mid-April, and livestock producers already knew that they were going to have problems with water supply. Fortunately, we got some snow right at the end of April that provided some runoff and some relief. And really, people were looking for ways to pump water. If they had a water supply, they were pumped. We try to get information out to producers during this time period, basically with timely suggestion. It's like, if you've got water to pump and fill a dugout, do it now because it's going to be gone. And the snow really did help. And we did provide a support program in order to enhance water supply, but it becomes problematic because there's only so much you can do. Like, yes, a new well might be a possibility, but you only have so many well drillers. So right from the bat, water supply was a problem for livestock producers. And then going into a dry fall last year, pastures were already in trouble, already not able to support livestock. So as the dry conditions continued throughout the years, pastures continued to decline. And then you roll to mid-August when things were really dry, and that's where people were recognizing they didn't have enough feed for their livestock, and breeding herds started to get reduced. People were selling at very depressed prices simply because they didn't have enough feed. So we do have some programming in place to provide some support through one of our federal provincial programs that we provide to producers in times of emergency like this under ag recovery. And people are applying now and dealing with that. So that is a very quick summary of the livestock sector. As far as the crop sector goes, producers, the snow that we got right at the end of April and into May was enough to get crops off to a great start. So, seeding went normally and everything like that. And then it just continued to be dry. So producers would, like at that point, there's not a lot a producer can do. You try to farm the best you can. Again, we would provide timely information, and you go out throughout the season. Greg had a really good point. The producers who happen to be in an area that caught a thunderstorm or some rain or were able to retain some moisture in the field, they ended up with getting some really good yields if they had those rains right at the timely basis. So it's not just the amount of rain, but it's when you get that rain that becomes so important. One thing that we have a number of farmers that have invested in controlled tile drainage, so they put control structures in their tile drainage. That lets them basically turn off their drainage system. And those producers that were able to do that and hold back that inch of water just becomes really critical. So last year really showed the advantage of controlled drainage. And for the producers that end up, crop insurance just becomes, you know, it's an insurance program and you never want to collect insurance program. But 2021 was one of those years that many producers, unfortunately, will be collecting crop insurance. We won't know what those payouts are or anything like that. It really, next year at this time, we'd probably be able to give a better idea as to what the financial impacts were from the lack of crop production, the lack of rain. So that really covers off the crop side, with crop insurance being one of the big things we do, and then we do provide timely information as we can. So if you want to advance to the next slide, then I'll just quickly touch on the irrigation sector. And as far as licensed water allocation. So as far as the irrigation goes, and I said we have about 1% of our land that we irrigate, but it's really important. It's our high value crops that go in for the vegetable sector and to supply potatoes for our potato processing plants. It just ends up being really important. So we have 3 sources of irrigation water. One of them is capturing snow melt. So snow melt gets captured in retention ponds and used later. And those were really, really problematic. We have producers that were not able to fill, so therefore they had no water supply. Then they went from being basically irrigated production to dryland production, and that caused problems. So anybody that had to rely on those systems that captured snow melt were problems. When we determine the allocation amounts for irrigation water, there is an element of risk. We talk about the 80% risk of those we use. And unfortunately, last year was one of those years that was in that 80%. But it wasn't just a, you know, when you talk about it, it's actually, in some cases, it was like virtually zero water. So it's not like you didn't partially fill your pond, you didn't fill your pond. So those were the ones that by far were the most impacted. Then we have people that irrigate out of aquifers, and aquifers by far are the most reliable water supply and were impacted the less during the drought because they are really managed for long term. So anybody that is on the aquifer and had good, they really were able to irrigate basically okay. They were really impacted more by the heat, the high weather and things like that, but their yields were okay. Then we turn around to the people that are involved with streams. And if there was a dam on the river, like the Assiniboine River, the water supply was basically all right through the years. Other water supplies weren't. And we would monitor on a regular basis to see where they're at making decisions. And when it comes right at where they were impacted the most was if the stream flows got down to the point where there had to be reductions in the amount of water they were pumping. In some cases, irrigators had to stop pumping. They were somewhat impacted. The things we learned, communication was really important, trying to minimize the reduction when things had to be cut off. Charlie's going to show a slide in a minute that shows really the critical period when the Red River got low, and it's really the time frame. Greg talked about the end of August for sugar beets. For us, it was a little bit earlier. We got those really timely rains starting in mid-August, and that really added a lot to. It really helped as far as producers who had temporary reductions or ceased reductions. It was just like, it was great. We got a timely rain, and that made a big difference. And then Greg talked about the importance of that mid-August rain on sugar beets for south of the line. For us, it was really important for potatoes, because that's when potatoes are bulking, and that extra moisture that came from rainfall really helped as far as the bulking of the potato crop, and it really took the pressure off anybody that even could irrigate. When you really struggle to keep up, that really came in. So those are the things that really came from the irrigation system. So that's sort of a summary. A really tough year for ag producers, and fortunately farmers are resilient, and we recognize that, you know, when you end up with extreme weather events, it really impacts the industry. And one thing that really want to stress is just the importance of communication between various government departments, various municipalities, various stakeholders and irrigators, and that really tries with that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carly.
Thanks, Brian. So just a few last comments on this slide. Oh, sorry, Greg, can you just back it up one? About more the municipal users versus the irrigators. So we did have a handful or so of municipal water systems that are relying on surface water sources that did have to deploy temporary pumps because the water levels in the rivers or streams drop below their intake levels. So we supported these municipalities or water co-ops kind of in, you know, really a whole of government approach through things like conditions updates, engineering and technical planning support, help navigating the regulatory approval process, and in some cases we were able to provide some funding support for these municipalities or water co-ops through the Manitoba Water Services Board. So now you can go to the next slide, great, thanks. So Brian alluded to the importance of communication and coordination throughout the drought, both internally within government and externally with our stakeholders and Manitobans. So I just want to quickly touch on kind of how we accomplished that through the drought of 2021. So we did have to set up, or we have set up currently, several internal committees that take a look at either drought more as a whole, which is our Manitoba Drought Assessment Committee, or they look at specific aspects of drought like water supply shortages or communication. So those committees were very active throughout the drought of 2021. Some were already set up, some we had to set up in response to the drought, but that really allowed us to hit the ground running once those were in motion and meeting regularly. Externally, we also have basin drought assessment groups. So again, some of these were already set up prior to the drought. Like we have groups that meet regularly for management of Stephenfield Reservoir and the Boyd River system, as well as we have a Shellmouth liaison committee. So these groups are usually composed of, you know, members of government as well as external stakeholders and water users that are impacted within the basin. So we met regularly with those groups and added a few new basin drought assessment groups in 2021 to make sure that we were understanding the impacts and helping to manage the water shortages in the various systems. We also do regular conditions reporting, which we did increase the frequency of that throughout the drought. So we do monthly water availability and drought conditions reports. We have a Manitoba Drought Monitor. We also have weekly crop reports and Manitoba Ag Weather Program reports to send out timely data and information. Another thing that we did a lot of in 2021 was you know, new programming, as well as trying to spread the word about that programming to producers and other stakeholders. So we did set up a Managing Dry Conditions webpage that had a programming summary, included resources and guidance for producers. We put out a lot of news releases, social media, and industry newsletters, directing folks to those resources as well. And finally, I'll just quickly touch on coordination across the international Red River watershed. So we did have a lot of discussions with our neighbors about transboundary management of low flows. So we did that through various channels, including Red River Basin Commission's Water Supply Committee, the International Red River Watershed Board, and we also had some informal meetings with the various agencies throughout the summer of 2021 as well. Okay, next slide, Greg. So now I'll jump into looking at where we're at now and do a quick recap of current conditions. So I'll start with soil moisture. That's the next slide, Greg. So this map is showing both 2021 and 2020 fall moisture surveys. So the 2021 fall moisture survey map is based on data from about 103 weather stations across Manitoba here, and it was surveyed on November 18th of 2021. So you can see that overall, going into winter, our soil moisture in 2021 is definitely better off than we were in 2020. We still have some dry regions kind of in the south central and interlake regions and then out towards the west as well, but we are definitely in a better position this past fall than we were in the fall of 2020. So on the next slide here, I'll show a map of percent of normal accumulated precipitation. So this is the precipitation that we've seen from the 1st of November through till January 9th. So anything that's in the green shading or purple is either normal to above normal. So you can see that we do have some regions of normal to above normal around the Winnipeg and Selkirk areas and then out in the southeast. However, much of Agri-Manitoba is classified more in the 60 to 85% of normal or 40 to 60% of normal. So we do have some large regions of below normal precipitation where we are currently in the winter season. Next slide, please. So I'll just touch on current river, these are flows in the Red River at Emerson. So I'm showing a percentile plot. You can see the observed flow is the black line that occurred throughout 2020, 2021, and where we're at now into 2022. So you can see I'm just showing a few kind of points to mention here that the lowest flow that we did see in 2021 happened right at the end of August, and it dipped down into the less than the 10th percentile at 220 CFS. But we did get those mid-August, late August rains, and again, more rains in the fall that bumped us into above normal conditions along the Red River main stem. So right now you can see that we have a flow of about 1440 CFS as of yesterday, and we're just at that cusp between above normal and normal conditions. So flows are looking really good in the Red River, at least from a drought perspective. Okay, and I think the next slide is my final slide. So just to kind of wrap this all up, so although we did see some improvement in conditions in most areas through the Canadian Drought Monitor maps and through these late summer and fall precipitation, we can see that the drought conditions do continue to persist, and we really do need above normal precipitation throughout the winter to fully alleviate this extensive dryness, which unfortunately we haven't seen that yet throughout most of Agri-Manitoba. So I'm really hoping for quite a wet January, February. We do still have concerns remaining over feed availability and on-farm water supplies, as Brian talked to, going into 2022. So we'll have to see what the next few months bring in terms of snowpack to hopefully alleviate some of those concerns. There are a few water supply spots that we are still monitoring very closely that have low levels. Those primarily are Lake Minnewaska and Jackson Lake. So we're monitoring those closely and hoping again for some runoff to help the levels there in the spring. And just in terms of what we'll be doing over the next few months, we're going to continue to monitor the conditions closely and coordinate with our drought committees and continue to communicate regularly with our stakeholders on conditions and programming and resources. And I think that's all that we have. So I'll pass it back to you, Greg. Thanks.
So thank you, Carly. And of course, you brought up that there was that cross-border communication that was going on. Again, Nicole Armstrong was important in setting that up so that North Dakota, Minnesota, and Manitoba were discussing water supply issues and also low water flows on rivers so that could help plan for things going through the late summer and into the fall. So now we're going to go into the last part of this, is the road to recovery. And it's a good thing Ted lost his watch last night somewhere in the hospitality room, so he's unable to keep track of the current time.
All right, good morning. My name is Mike Welvert. I'm from the River Forecast Center down in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. I'm going to take the reins here for a moment and talk about we've talked about drought and where we were. Let's talk about where we're going and see what we're looking forward to for the coming spring here. So we'll take a quick look at current conditions, look at the factors that go into spring flooding. I know you all know them, but we'll just review them. And then maybe take a snapshot of what possibilities we might have. My colleague Justin is going to join us here at the end. Bottom line is it's kind of early yet, but let's take a look at what we know. So we talked about already, and my colleagues have already mentioned that we got some of that timely rain in the fall. Here's a graphic for October through December to finish out the calendar year. And you can see across the Red River Valley that we had above normal precipitation in the fall, which has gone into really giving us some improvement as we've all talked about already. Anywhere from an inch or two to as much as 4 to 5, maybe even 6 inches above normal in the Red Valley. So that's nice. It's allowed us to recharge the soil moisture a bit, get that back up to closer to normal. Also, the stream flows have climbed up to closer to normal as well. So the base stream flow from the U.S. Geological Survey going into our freeze up this fall, so this graphic is from November, shows that we were in the higher percentiles across much of the valley. Some of the areas in green were right around what we would consider normal flows, but anywhere in the light blue or dark blue, we're talking about the upper percentiles of flow. So we actually had some water moving into the river and just get those flows back up closer to normal before we went into the freeze up period. So that was a good thing. Carly showed this graphic for Emerson. Here it is for Grand Forks. You can see that for 19 and 20, we were way up in the upper percentiles during that whole time frame. But then you can see where the dry conditions really set in 2021. So this is for Grand Forks. And you can see that we were in the lower percentiles much of the year. But we did have that recovery toward the end of the year. So now we're back up closer to the normal range, even leaning closer to that upper percentiles again. So looking at the ingredients that go into spring flooding, fall moisture and the base stream flow, we've talked about those. We've kind of crept back up toward normal. What other ingredients go into a flood? We'll talk about frost depth. Do we have deep frost across the area? Looking at temperatures, again, this is the fall temperatures. It's showing a map of generally above normal temperatures. So it was a little bit warmer than it normally is. So we didn't get the frost to really start driving too deeply early on in the fall. But as we've moved into the last couple of weeks, we all know it's been pretty brutally cold up here, anywhere from 15 to as much as 20 or 25 degrees below normal. So that's really allowed the frost to start driving deep. And the snowpack isn't too deep yet, so that cold is able to penetrate into the ground and get down to the deeper levels. So frost depths have, after starting out kind of slow, they've now gone down deep enough to where we consider about normal for this time of January. The Grand Forks report on Monday was around 23 inches. We see some varying reports, kind of depends on exposure and where the snow is at and where it isn't. But in general, we've got about a foot, give or take, of or maybe 2 feet of frost, 2 feet of frost in the northern valley, maybe more closer to a foot in the southern valley in the headwater areas. So a little bit less frost down there, but we still have plenty of time left to develop more frost in the ground. What about snow cover? This is a graphic I took from Monday from the remote sensing group that's based in our office down in the Twin Cities. Looking at the snow map there, anything in the yellows or even that green is above 12, maybe 14 inches of snow on the ground. The orangish colors are kind of around 10 inches. And then the reds would be anywhere, you know, from 4 to up to 8 maybe. So you can see there's more snow in the Red Valley, especially as you get into the lower part of the basin. In the upper parts, a little bit less snow. But in general, we've got some snow out there, which is different than last year. So that's nice to see. How much water is in that snow? Looking at this graphic, you can see in general, it's an inch or 2 of water contained within that snow that's on the ground, maybe some pockets up around 3 inches. So it's good to see that we've got some water on the landscape that will maybe soak in a little bit, hopefully if we get a good thaw. But as mentioned before too, a lot of this does tend to run off. So that's going to be our potential for a flood. And then of course we have more months where we can add to the snow. So in general, the average water content we would consider for this time of year about normal in that 1 to 3 inch range, as I said. So that's frost depth and the snowpack. What about, and the water content. So what about in the future? How are we going to melt all this? Well, again, it's kind of early. So here is a graphic of, what did Greg put in here? He put in here, this is a loop of what, the last 2-3 days? Yeah, next few days. So you can see we have. Yeah. Greg was mentioning that this is the storm system that's due in for latter part of Thursday. So if you're staying late, be looking for this to be affecting you. So we're going to step through what's coming up here in the next few days to a few weeks to a few months. So this is the QPF, the amount of rainfall we're expecting over the next 7 days. And you can see that general band that runs through the western part of the basin and then stretches down into southern Minnesota and Iowa. So we do have a little bit of precipitation coming. If we go out 2 weeks, this is the generalized outlook that's updated every day. Right now, it's looking like for the next couple of weeks, we've got generally below normal temperatures expected, and the precipitation near normal, maybe just slightly above normal. So be looking for a little bit of snow in that time frame the next couple of weeks. Moving out to the end of January into early February, still continuing that trend for below normal temperatures. So another cool stretch we're expecting. Precipitation is kind of equal chances whether we're going to see some snow or not. So maybe an average amount as we go through into the early part of February. Stretching further out all the way February through April. Really no clear indications right now if we're going to see above normal or below normal. So just in general, expect kind of a normal-ish end of the winter here, I guess. And if we look at that and how the thaw cycle and how, if we're going to get any heavy rain on our snow melt, of course, it's too early for us to tell that yet. So we're not sure about how that's going to impact the flooding, but of course, that's a big ingredient. If we get a late blizzard in April and then a bunch of rain on top of it, that could be not a good scenario for a flood anyway. So I'm going to let my colleague Justin take over now, and he's going to talk about the amount of possibilities that we have.
Okay, so this was the illicit preview of the flood outlook that Ted was talking about earlier. Preliminary data, not for public consumption yet, but this is kind of the outlook, the charts that you see on the outlook. The official one comes out in 2 weeks. I could talk a lot about how to interpret the chart, but kind of in the interest of time, the brief rundown on it is the blue dot line is the historical simulation, essentially represents what we expect as a normal distribution of flood peaks for a year. And then the black triangles are the conditional simulation, which is essentially resetting that historical simulation with the conditions that we're seeing as of January 10th. And with some of that QPF for the next 7 days is in there. And then running that through the spring and taking off the flood peaks through May 10th for this chart here. So as you can see, the normal is quite a bit lower for most of that range of flood peaks than the conditional simulation. So right now, given the excess soil moisture that or excess precipitation that we saw in the late fall and some of this extra snowpack that we've gotten early on, and then the QPF coming up, we're seeing essentially wetter than normal conditions this year. So kind of a big reversal from last year. So right now, this is Fargo, the 50% chance is right at the major flood level in the conditional simulation. And then basically the same chart for Grand Forks. The flood chances are slightly reduced just because the thresholds are a little bit different, but essentially the same thing, just expecting a little bit higher than normal flood chances this year. So with that, I'll hand it back to Greg. Oh, skip that one.
I'm just going to say the shooting hasn't started, so we're pretty good. No, so again, and you've heard me say this before, a little bit of flooding is a good thing. So that minor to moderate flooding is average for this basin in a regular year, and we need that to help clear out deadwood so that Dr. Joe can get his tree ring surveys in. But also, again, it's very important to the local ag economy and everything else to get that base moisture in. This shows, again, those type of ESP outlooks are showing, well, in Grand Forks, moderate. Well, you got a big dike there. Fargo, again, recall that flood stage is a little low set, that major flood stage, but still, that means that there's water to move.
It's all
in the
that
rivers.
does is let me talk.
Hello? So anyway, I did put this last thing up, and that's just the 79, 80, 81. So you can see from 79 going into the drought, late 79 into 80, and then 81 back up.